All right. So you should see a notice in the corner that I've started to record, and I'm going to say a brief welcome again, just to say we're very glad to be hosting Charles Todd and Caroline Todd, who write as Charles Todd with their 2 series on Ian Rutledge and Bess Crawford. And again, thanks so much for being here. And we'll turn it over to you. I'm going to turn my camera off as well now. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. I'm freezing up here. I think you're freezing in Washington, but it's nice to be here today. I don't have to travel.
Well, with that kind of introduction, I shouldn't tell people that I live in South Florida, so you don't want to know what the temperature is right now. But this is our latest book. I hope you can see it. There we go. Fatal Lie. It will be released on the 16th of February, and so we're very excited. For authors, it's always wonderful when the book actually comes out. Yes, professional reviewers do reviews, and it's wonderful to see it in print, but when the book actually comes out is when we start hearing from our readers that, and it's that feedback that tells us whether or not the story that we tried to tell actually came through on the other end. It's kind of like a movie, Caroline, isn't it?
Absolutely. We never planned to write together, you know. It just was one of those things that happened. Both of us are history buffs. Both of us are mystery buffs. We share that. We both love words. And I think that was one of the factors that brought us together as a team. I'd always wanted to write. I've been dabbling with writing since I was 7. Josh was a business writer. He had a very different approach to literature. He was one of these people who knew how to put one, a, subletter, which I couldn't even do in high school. I hated it. But he was good at that. And so he's more the, shall I say, the organized one. So we'll talk more about that in a bit.
Actually, my background was in technical writing because I worked for a large corporation and did a lot of training and writing of technical manuals. So everything had to be in outline form so that we could distribute textbooks and that kind of thing. But actually, at first, the idea of trying to create a story without any guardrail, so to speak, made it very difficult for me. But now that we've been doing it, my gosh, it's hard to believe that Test of Wills, our first book, was published 25 years ago this year. And here we are, what, 30 some books later and still at it. But it's more interesting for us when we don't know where it's going. It allows our story to develop based on the characters, which are the true drivers of our stories.
You know, we had to learn to collaborate. It's something that didn't come easily because we're both 2 strong-willed people. But I think all the mysteries we had read, all the movies we had seen, shaped our thinking and shaped our ability to get people in and out of the room, to know who was speaking, how the action worked. These are the things that actually took us about a year to learn how to do. We just thought about this, talked about this, when we had seen an actual mystery on a battlefield, something historians have been able to solve. And we were talking about that on the way home, and when we got where we were going in Charlotte, I think to Charles, would you like to write a mystery about our field? And his reaction was, no.
You have to understand, I'm driving down the interstate in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Caroline comes up with that idea from the back seat, and I did not have any clue. But as time went by and my job changed, I was a what they call an operations analyst for a large company, which meant that basically I was a corporate troubleshooter. And so I was the guy who showed up when you didn't want that guy to show up. And so in the evening times, I wasn't exactly invited to people's houses for dinner. And hotels become very boring very quickly. And as a way to wind down and end my day, I contacted Caroline and asked her if she was serious about it. And that was when the internet and everything was just getting started. You have to remember, this was 1994. There was rudimentary email, and then later this online text messaging system, nothing like what you have with your phone. But it allowed us to spend a lot of time communicating with each other when they still had things like long distance phone call charges.
Yes.
So
They kept AT&T in business.
it allowed us to try different ways of working together. And as Caroline said, it took us a while to figure out exactly how to make it work so that our primary goal was we were there to entertain and hopefully inform, but not to confuse our readers. We wanted a comprehensive story that spoke with one voice. We don't want somebody reading along in a story and mentally having to shift and say, oh, that's right, Charles is writing now. Oh, wait a minute, let's go back to Caroline, or vice versa. Because when you're reading a book, you're reading a book to enjoy it, not to have to deal with those kinds of technical aspects. And coming from that point of view, it allowed us to avoid some of the arguments that you would normally get into, because our primary focus was what is best for Ian Rutledge, what is best for Bess Crawford, not I want or I think. It's a typical trap that a lot of writers get into. They'll sit down and they'll write something and they're so enamored with it. Oh, this is beautiful scenes. Some of my best writing. The description is just incredible. And then you step back and you look at it and you say, yes, it is beautiful, but it's not pertinent. It doesn't advance the story. And so you don't even need to put that into the book.
Talk a little bit about the characters. When we first started, we wanted to have a character who did his own work. We didn't want him to be influenced by what's going on in the forensic lab. And so we chose a period where the forensics are there, but they weren't really fully defined. And therefore, Rutledge could be a man who thinks and acts for himself, much in the tradition of the golden age of mystery. He has a car, which is a real car. I've been in it. He can use a telephone, things like that.
I'm going to jump in for a second because I noticed it pop up. It is a 1914 Rolls-Royce Ghost touring car, where we know the owners, and the car is in mint condition with the original engine and everything. So we've been over every square inch of it, driven it. started it, and yes, it is crank start. So kind of gives you an example of the depth we go into in terms of some of our research. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
The main thing with Rutledge, we wanted to talk about the Great War. Nobody was writing about the Great War in 1996. And we felt that this was a very good backdrop for the kind of history we wanted to tell. The war had changed England, it had changed Europe, it changed the US. But we talked about Britain because they suffered most in the war. We put Rutledge in Scotland Yard. He was shell-shocked, and the best way to demonstrate this was to bring in Hamish, the voice in his head. That, for example, so let us show what the women's role in the Great War had been. They really contributed. They agreed with Parliament that they would put aside their marches for the vote, and they would help in any way they could, and would expect to be rewarded with the vote later on. And so they chose a nurse because she could see the battlefield and the home front. And we gave her a background that was not traditionally English. We wanted her to be a very different person from the third Victorian, putting her in a military situation with her father. We got to take her to India and other places, which was good for us, but also gave us a chance to learn to shoot, learn to ride, learn to take orders, and to have a firm sense of duty of our own.
The other aspect of developing the character, first of all, we both love England and have traveled there extensively, and I don't think it would be fair to not mention how much that drove our choice of location, as well as what happened in England. But as we travel all over England, and had been doing so long before we started writing the Rutledge books, we started developing an interesting cast of characters, because it's by going to these small towns and little villages and talking to the people, going to the weekly market at the town square and talking to the bread makers and the cheese makers and the people who had all kinds of crafts and things that they were selling at the marketplace. British people are quite reserved and don't particularly care to talk about themselves, but we found two interesting facts. One, they're very eager to talk about their dog. And two, if you start talking to them about the wares that they're selling, or if you're in a inn or a pub getting something to eat, talking to them about the place, they open right up to you. And through that, a lot of our characters are in many ways a conglomeration of a variety of different people that we have met, and we think it adds a certain level of realism. The other thing that we found when we were doing our research was how much England was really different from the United States in World War I. We tend to think of Rosie the Riveter from World War II because of the level of women's involvement in society and manufacturing during the wartime. That took place in England, and it was a major shift. You had gone from the Victorian and Edwardian period, where women's roles in society, depending on their class, was very structured, and it was a strongly patriarchal society, to a situation where all of a sudden women had to get involved. They were the lorry drivers, the post delivery people, the people working in the factories, making munitions. And as a result, you couldn't really put all that back into the jar and screw the lid tight when the war was over, because their perceptions had changed, as well as the perceptions of the men who had served in the war and the nurses and other people that traveled. All of a sudden, people were traveling to places that they ordinarily would never travel. People in places like Shropshire that had never been more than 20 or 30 miles from their home, all of a sudden were in places like France and Gallipoli and Italy and those kinds of places that they hadn't even read about in books, much less visited themselves. And as a result, it brought about dramatic changes in British society, along with the fact that an entire generation of young men had been sacrificed in that war. That's why weddings went down, the birth rate went down, because there weren't young men in the villages anymore.
So where did we come up with our ideas? This is one of the questions we frequently get. You never know where an idea will come from. You stumble over things and you have to test them and find out if they're really an idea that can be developed, or an idea that's better for a short story, or an idea that belongs in a maybe next time file in the office. For example, if you've read The Black Ascot, that began when we were coming through a book about the period and trying to do something with a different part of the period. We stumbled over a photograph of the 1910 Ascot races. The king had just died in the spring, and there was a lot of discussion about whether or not they should cancel the races, but that was the start of the social season, and people wanted to go ahead. So they decided they would have this as a memorial to the late king, and everybody would wear black lace, black shirts, black ties, black hats, black brollies. Anything that they wore had to be black in remembrance of the king, because he loved the races and would love to have been there. And so we looked at that and we thought, that would be a very interesting idea. The only trouble was, that was 1910, and we were writing in 1920. So we thought about it and thought, a cold case. Rutledge is assigned a cold case. And that's how the whole book began. When we were in eighth grade for the last book, we wandered around. We'd been there before, but we wandered around and the light was very good that day. And we looked at one statue standing there, a dolmen, a monolith. But the way it was shaped by the wind and the weather, it had the appearance of a statue. It looked like something Rodin had carved. And so we looked and thought, that's a lovely thing to hide a body. And so that's how that book got started. So you never know. The characters fill in the idea, they take it and run with it. They make it interesting, they make it exciting, they have secrets, but they deliver much of the ideas that we want to expand upon, and we let them run. We don't try to shape them and say, okay, we want you to do this in the next chapter. We much prefer to wait until the next chapter and see what they tell us. And quite often, it's much better than something we could have come up with ourselves.
The only problem is when you're writing a 90,000 word manuscript and you get to 80,000 words and you still don't know who did it. That can make life a little difficult. But at the same time,
my husband crazy.
we're we're following the story where it leads. And to be honest with you, our feeling is if we already know who did it and how it ends, where's the fun in writing it? Because our goal is to travel along with Rutledge and Bess and various characters that are in the story to see where the story leads. And it's also our way of keeping ourselves honest. One of the most frustrating things I find when reading other mysteries or watching productions of those mysteries on television and on film is where they get to the end and all this information comes in. It's the old "the butler did it" kind of thing. We see it as almost a race between us and the reader. We want the reader to be one step behind us so that when you get to the end of a book, you have that feeling of satisfaction that the mystery was actually solved. And even though it may have an unexpected ending, you can think back or look back through the book and say, oh, okay, this is how it had to be, this person. And also at the same time, because of writing during a set historical period, while we don't, for example, go into a great deal of detail about the death penalty, because in that time period, that was an accepted part of the criminal justice system, Rutledge is still very aware of the fact that if he brings charges against a particular person in the course of the mystery, that person ultimately, if charged with murder, is going to be facing the death penalty. So it's incumbent on him and the type of character that he is not to take that responsibility lightly.
One of the things we have also learned, we can't use anything that our characters would not have known at the time. I remember my father saying about World War II that he learned more about it afterwards when all the documentaries began than he had known at the time. And this was true in England during the war. And a lot of people thought Churchill had no future. We can't sort of think, oh, he's the next prime minister, because nobody would have believed it. It would have been out of character, out of period. So we have to be very careful reading a book to judge, while we're doing research, to judge what they knew versus what later historians have learned. So it's a very tight rope. We've only used one historical character in the books, and that was Rudyard Kipling, simply because something in his real childhood was very similar to something that Bess was discovering, and that might have been related to her own childhood if she had had different parents. So that was a necessity. I don't really think that your people have their own personality, and you can't put that in a book and change it. It has to stay true to who they are and what they are and how they saw the world. So
a lot of our research is based on letters home from the front or vice versa. Newspapers of the day are extremely important to us because not only are we interested in what's being printed as far as news, etc., but what's being advertised. What's the fashion? What's the style? What are people wearing? What are people buying? What is the latest new thing for that snapshot in time versus going back? One of the seminal books on World War I is The Guns of August. But once again, there's a book that was written after the whole war was over. And it colors it a lot. I remember my father saying to his father right after Pearl Harbor, he told me, he said to his father, "We are going to win this, aren't we?" And his father's response was, "I don't know."
And that was true in the Great War. It's really a challenge to use the history and use it as it really would have happened if these people had existed in this day and age. One of the things we really feel strongly about is to let the reader know something about what that period was like. It was a very important period in history. It shaped the whole 20th century. It's shaping this century in many ways. And so we didn't want it forgotten. We didn't want that war to be something distant. We wanted it to be something with relevance today. And I hope we've succeeded on that. We've talked a lot about things. What have you got to say?
So I'm going to start with some of the things that were in the chat earlier, and I know that you've touched on a few of them, but those that you haven't, I'll try to recap with a bit. So one of the early questions was how you chose World War I, because I've read that you're Anglophiles, but there's not just one war period or one period of English history that appeals to you, according to what I've read. So do you think you might go to, I don't know, some other, to the English Civil War, or you just love this period entirely?
The main thing was, I'm sorry.
Part of the thing for us was they had never seen a situation anywhere where an entire country or several countries were so dramatically changed. In the Peter Jennings book on the 20th century and Tom Brokaw's book on the 20th century, and several others, they talk about World War I as being the pivotal event of the 20th century. And it kind of goes back to what Caroline was saying earlier about how it's still relevant today. The World War I and the Treaty of Versailles laid the unfortunate foundation for a lot of the difficulties that we're still having in the Middle East, in the Caucasus, and all around the world, that are directly tied back to the decisions that were made coming into and then out of that war. And so it gave an interesting setting for us. And also, one of the things that we liked when we started the Rutledge series was Rutledge had started out as a policeman and then later inspector, whose job it was to catch murderers. And then he goes off and serves 4 years in the trenches on the Western Front and becomes a killer himself. And then comes back to try and resume his career at Scotland Yard, catching murderers again. And in many ways, his perspective on murder has changed as a result of his experience. And he has a better understanding of the mental process. One of the things that we stress in our movies, in our books, is we don't deal with gangs in London. We don't deal with organized crime because those, in many ways, are senseless killings or killings driven by certain aspects. the part of murder that fascinates us the most is what causes an ordinary person to feel that the only solution that they have to a particular situation is to kill.
Yep.
And what are the thought processes that go into that result in that type of behavior? And then what happens to them as a result of becoming a murderer? Or in some cases, a multiple murder. And it's kind of like the thing where as a child, you may have a memory of doing something wrong and saying to someone else or thinking to yourself, just act normal. And all of a sudden you don't know what normal is anymore. And that it's that chase between Rutledge and the guilty party to see who can catch the murderer and whether or not the murderer can escape Rutledge's eye.
We like the psychology more than we like the blood. I mean, that's something that intrigues us. Why does a normal person change later? It's very similar to history. When a nation can't take it any longer, it usually turns to war to solve the problems, and amongst people, it's usually murder.
Yep. So Patrick had another question. How did you learn to create such convincing styles of speech for your many diverse characters?
Oh, that's traveling all over England. We've been doing that for quite some time. We have friends who live in England, and I watch a lot of masterpieces as Charles does, and English movies. So your ear gets attuned. In fact, I find myself when I'm in England, to my friends, well, when you're shopping, while you're at the market today, which pick up the bananas. I didn't say that at all, but my ear is attuned, and I think Charles do the same thing. You go into a market, and you can see the various different accents. If we tried to copy them completely, it would be very difficult to read. I mean, I've heard some of the accents that I have to say, pardon? Because I can't get it. But Agatha Christie said, she was asked about Poirot and his, he said it's important to capture the rhythm of the speech. And so you try to do that. You try to
We're kind of losing your audio.
Yeah. So
We're kind of losing your audio there, Caroline.
Oh, I know. That's Comcast's fault. I keep telling them. Go ahead.
What did Agatha Christie say? You were quoting Agatha Christie and we lost it.
Oh, okay. Agatha Christie said, you don't want to mimic the accent. You want the rhythm of the accent. And if you listen to Poirot, you hear the rhythm.
Yep.
And so for us listening to the rhythm of how they speak, rather than an accent that's so dense that it sounds like Beowulf.
Yep. So one of the questions that I'm sure you have gotten many times came from Amy about what led you to create Hamish as a character.
The only way we could actually show Rutledge's shell shock, besides the obvious nightmares and the
Can I kind of
hoping.
I'm going to step on you for just a second. We tried writing Rutledge in first and second and third person to try and figure out what point of view we wanted in our books. And one of the issues we came up with was the third person type of point of view that we used worked well for the case, but how then do you describe Rutledge's shell shock? Then go ahead, Caroline.
So the main thing was auditory responses to shell shock are real. They are rare, but they do happen. And having him with a companion sort of gave him an outlet of talking it through, of dealing with the situation. The Japanese, when they took the first book, A Test of Wills, called Hamish Rutledge's Watson. And in some ways, this is true. He gives Rutledge, he can know no more than Rutledge knows. He can't leap ahead and tell Rutledge who did it. But he can see things that Rutledge's subconscious is telling Rutledge, but the subconscious is using Hamish's voice. And this gives Rutledge, it's both aggravating and it's irritating, and it's also very, very useful at times. People ask us if we are ever going to let Rutledge heal, but people didn't heal from shell shock. That was the problem. They learned to cope or they killed themselves. It was as simple as that. And Rutledge was.
And to one of the smart things we did was we, each book pretty much takes place right after the one before. So remembering that the armistice was in 1918, but the peace treaty wasn't signed until 1919. Rutledge comes back to Scotland Yard in 1919, and we're just now getting into 1921. So we're not 20 years later, whatever, only a couple of years have passed. Yes, we're in the process right now of with A Fatal Lie. This is the 23rd book in the Inspector Rutledge series, and I want to make sure I get this 100% correct. It begins in the early spring of 1921. So there hasn't been a lot of time that has passed for Rutledge to suddenly be well.
This is why we chose this shortened time frame, because we're following not only the mysteries, but how Rutledge grows and deals and copes. If you did a book every year, setting it 19, 20, 21, you would have glimpses of that, but you wouldn't really understand what's going on inside this man and why he has the insight he does, and also the feeling that he belongs in the murderer category more than he does in the detective category.
Yeah, not to mention the fact if we put them a year apart, it would be 1944 now.
Oh, well. We've been talking about what storyline that we're going to come up with for a short story dealing with his great-grandson. So sometimes it gets a little confusing when we're dealing with the in hand, something else pops up and we think, oh, wouldn't that be interesting in another book?
So I'm going to go on. There was a follow-up question that I think you've answered, that it says that you capture Rutledge's mental and emotional issues so realistically. How did you come by the knowledge? But it does sound like you did some serious research about this. And I'm curious, as an adjunct to that question, whether you know of cases where someone's expression of shell shock involved another person in their mind.
We have talked briefly to someone who understood Hamish even better than we did. But we have seen shell shock. I saw it as a child. There was a man in our town who had been shell shocked in World War One, and an ordinary man, and then something snaps, and he's in the middle of the road, directing traffic to the front, just as he did when the shell exploded close to him. I also know someone who had a great deal of trouble after Vietnam, and Charles knows people from World War II and so on. The problem is,
Not to mention the fact we also talk with a great deal of psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health professionals because we did not intend for shell shock to be some gimmick that we put into a book to make it unique. We wanted it to be something that was as realistic as possible and based on actual fact, and to make sure that we properly represented the experiences of all these veterans that we knew that had suffered so much in varying degrees. The number of military personnel, especially coming back from World War I and World War II, that wound up alcoholics is phenomenal, because that was the only way they could dull their senses and get away from it.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to move on. Sally wanted to make sure that people understood that there was a documentary called They Shall Not Grow Old that people should consider. And I just want to note that.
Peter Jackson did a wonderful job, and we highly recommend, if you haven't seen it, that. And 1917 was a very good movie.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that really amazed me in seeing They Shall Not Grow Old, going to the Imperial War Museum in London, we had seen many of those films in the jerky 1919 film. To see this turned into color, to hear the accents, to hear what the men were actually saying, was phenomenal. It was like being there with Rutledge. It's an amazing piece of documentary work.
Most people don't realize, I didn't until Jackson himself mentioned it at the end of the movie, a lot of the war front footage was taken by photographers using hand cranked cameras.
That's right.
And so as the situation became more difficult and more dangerous, out of excitement, they would start cranking their cameras faster and faster so that you had a variety of different speeds. But it's amazing. I have to throw this in. Not only is it driving cars of the period, but it's climbing over tanks. Caroline and I both went on a flight individually in a 1920 Great Lakes biplane in Indiana. Not only that, but it was in November when we did it, so it was quite chilly, but you actually go up in one of those planes and fly around and see what they saw from the cockpit looking down and those kinds of things. That's how you envelop yourself in a particular time period to try and be able to represent it as best as you possibly can.
I've been in a trench, a World War I trench, and I'm 5'3.5", 5'4". It showed you how short the men were in 1918, 1919. They were 5'6" was the average height. The patient was 5'6". His father was 5'5". these changes represent.
Pardon my dog.
What?
I said, pardon my dog who's barking in the background.
He's found a squirrel.
Yeah.
So Catherine asks and says that in the most recent books, the book often begins with the perpetrator committing the crime, and the reader knows more than Rutledge knows, and she's curious about that change. She thinks it seems to help the reader to figure out too much. So what is your thought about that change? Because it is a change in the structure, I think, in some of the recent ones.
Well, what we tried to do with the first chapter of the book is set up something about the mystery. In one of them, we had the daily, they come in and find the dead bodies. And another one we used a word that we had seen that had a very interesting history. For us to use that the reader knows that Rutledge. So we enjoy doing that first chapter in that fashion.
Unfortunately, we really aren't hearing you.
Again.
I'm sorry?
We can't hear you.
No, unfortunately.
Does it get better if I come closer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, what I was just saying to shorten it was that quite often the first chapter of the first scene sets up something about the murder that Rutledge does not know.
Yep.
Find out.
So
I blame part of it on the fact that I'm a big time Columbo fan anyway.
Nothing to do with it in my point of view.
So Rose asks about the origin story for Bess. So she said you may have mentioned it earlier, but she missed it. So a little recap of how Bess Crawford comes about.
We wanted to show how the women of World War I helped to win the war on the home front, what they did for the war effort in the hope of getting the vote.
Mm-hmm.
The war for Bess because we see both sides and the home front. Did that come through?
Basically, with Bess, what Caroline's trying to say is first of all, in Bess's character, we had talked about how she's not your typical Victorian woman. She is a woman of her time, a more modern person. She drives, she plays sports to a certain degree. She grew up part of her life growing up in India with her father as the colonel. We wanted to show what happened from the woman's perspective during that war. And by having Bess work both as a battlefield nurse and as someone who accompanies the critically injured back to England, we're able to show both aspects of what was going on at the front from the woman's point of view and what was taking place on the home front from the woman's point of view.
So those are all the ones that are in the chat. So I'm going to suggest that people unmute, and if they want to, try to take turns, but speak up now and share your questions directly. How's that sound? Patrick, you all need to unmute.
Thank you very much. Just first of all to say thank you so much for providing many, many years of very happy reading.
Oh, you have a great accent.
I hope that's not your to be read stack behind you.
They're all read, and there's the one I just finished. So, and about that, the mechanics of storytelling and the first scene in this book, and I won't give anything away for anyone who hasn't read it. Based on the information you give away in that first scene, I all the way through the book was thinking, this isn't quite right. No, I know who did it. And and then, and again, I won't spoil it, but then you did something just before the end that I thought I was wrong. And then I found out I wasn't wrong. So you made an absolutely beautiful structure. It totally fooled me right at the end, which is what we love detective stories for, right? When we get surprised at the end.
This comes out of the fact, Patrick, that we don't outline. We follow where the story takes us. And sometimes we don't know what the twist will be until we get there and understand enough about the characters and enough about the storyline. And we can say, that's carried this way or that way.
We
Sharon?
were really confused in Test of Wills, for example, when we'd followed the story all the way through, but there was something missing and we could not figure out what was missing. And once we figured out that a particular situation hadn't taken place, and Rutledge was able to discover what hadn't been done yet, that the whole thing fell into place. And as Caroline said, my father was our proofreader, and he would always say to us, I don't know how you're going to pull this off. You've got too many loose ends. It's never going to come together and be cohesive. And he would always say that right up to the end, and then he'd go, well, you pulled it off this time, but I'm telling you, one of these days.
So Sharon has a question. Yeah. Sharon?
Thank you, Deb. This has been wonderful. I've loved hearing your thought process and everything. I missed Caroline's audio at the beginning, wasn't fully clear to me, and I don't know whether you talked about this, but I'm interested more somewhat in your collaboration with each other. I know you said you didn't want one scene to sound like, well, that Charles wrote this and Caroline wrote this. How do you collaborate? Do you, one person writes and then the other edits, or does one person take on more of a character? This is what Ian's going to do, and I'm going to tell you what Jean's going to do.
Well,
talk about that.
To very straightforward, when we're in England or when we're together in a place that an idea begins to germinate, like seeing the picture of the black ascot, started a thought process of saying, okay, here's something fascinating. What can we do with it, if anything? Because sometimes our great ideas turn out to be nothing, or they work out well in a short story. We have published over 20 short stories in addition to our books. But basically, it goes back to our mutual love of movies, especially the oldies but goodies, where once we get that first chapter established and get the tone and the theme of the mystery, then we go into the second chapter where certain basic things take place. All right, Rutledge gets the case, he gets in the car, he drives to X. This is him pulling into the town. These are the people he meets right off. He needs to meet the innkeeper to get a room, the doctor, the constable, these kinds of things. Now your cast of characters is beginning to grow. And you write that scene. I'll write it, Caroline will write it, we'll email it back and forth, we'll pick and choose, okay, because we both know which direction we're going in. We know what that scene is going to be, and we both write it, and then we email it back and forth and fine tune it and tweak it and take bits and pieces and put it together into what we call the master manuscript, which we keep on Caroline's computer because I do all the marketing and stuff. So I'm out on the internet an awful lot more, and we don't want to expose our manuscript to problems. And then at the end of that scene, we stop and we say, okay, what happens next? What's the next logical step in Rutledge's investigation? Who does he go talk to next? And then things just pop in, like he finds something small, insignificant, that even he doesn't really realize what it is, and he just sticks it in his pocket and goes on, kind of thing. And sometimes later on in the book that becomes very relevant. Sometimes later on in the book it doesn't. We don't do red herrings a lot of times, and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really great mystery authors who do superb work beyond anything we've ever done. So our process is not the only process, but we don't sit down and say, okay, it's chapter 3. We need a red herring. Let's put in this clue, and it's not going anywhere, but we'll make the readers think that. It's more based on the tradition that Caroline and I come back to, is the old Southern, my granddaddy sitting on the back porch telling stories. We're trying to tell a story more than anything else.
So Hetty had her hand raised. I think she has a question as well.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Deb. Oh, thank you so much, Charles and Caroline. It was lovely hearing your talk today. I'm going as fast as possible with reading the books, and
don't get too fast, you'll catch up with us.
yeah, I know. A friend of mine got me started with you all. I'm of course a real lover of Anne Cleves and Louise
Oh,
Penny.
she's great.
Yeah, aren't they wonderful? Right. I'm in Washington, D.C., and they came to visit here. But my question is, when he's coming into the hotel, you know, for the night or for the next week of his work, I would like a little bit more culinary information, like when he sits down, you know, for his meals, and you know, just a little bit more about the food in general, and it just kind of adds a little bit more oomph to that.
You know, that's funny.
Let me say something here, Charles.
I worked in food for 20 years. I graduated from the Culinary Institute up in Hyde Park, New York.
Really?
I worked as a chef for a lot of years and then went on into management. It's odd. I'm thinking back now. That's interesting. That's something to bear in mind.
Let me say something about that.
Yes, ma'am.
We started describing his meals, and we got a note from our editor. Could you stop with the soup?
Oh,
You mean the entire meal? She said yes. Unless it's something special we all eat, we all don't need to hear what Rutledge is choosing. And I thought, well, there's some people who do.
yeah.
We're trying to put some things in without annoying the boss, so to
Okay,
speak.
sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, so
Thank
Kathy
you.
has her hand raised, and I'm going to have her be the last question for our session, but I'll have her give her question, okay?
I just reread A Test of Wills, and I'm wondering if this kind of sets the stage. A Test of Wills almost seemed to me to be as much of a test of wills between Hamish and
Exactly.
Rutledge as it did between Rutledge and Lettuce. And this seems
Absolutely.
to have continued. Am I incorrect or correct in this?
You're
You remember
absolutely
the quote?
correct.
I'm not going to, this is not a spoiler, but do you remember at the end of Test of Wills when Hamish says to Rutledge, I'm not done with you yet?
Absolutely.
But that was the time when Rutledge had to choose between thinking and insanity. And psychologists and psychiatrists who deal with shell shock and PTSD tell us that the men who struggle to cope usually make it. and men who can't find a way to cope usually kill themselves. And we have talked to many families in England who said to us, well, you know, we lost our uncle or our cousin or our father or grandfather. They shot themselves after the war. And you realize then how far into the society this had gone. And they wanted Rutledge to show in that first book that he understood this and was going to try to cope. So you're absolutely right.
There are two things that come out of that that really stuck with me. One, the men who would come back from the war, finish raising their children, see them off, perhaps retire. And once their children were raised and off and the money was there to look after their wives, then they would go out in the garden and shoot themselves. It's not unusual at all. The other thing that really struck me, we were doing a talk and book signing at the Tucson Book Festival in Arizona. And a man came up to me and shook my hand and said, "Thank you for Hamish." And, you know, when you're in that type of situation, then lots of people around, you know, "Oh, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed him." And he gripped my hand real tight and he looked me right square in the eye and he said, "No, you don't understand. Thank you for Hamish." And then he turned and walked away.
You know, you felt like crying because he was an older man with white hair. I would put him into his 70s, maybe 80s. He had a life.
Yeah. So I'm going to say this was wonderful. And we're glad that all of you could join us. And we're really grateful. Sure.
Best fans, if you haven't read Hanging at Dawn, try that. But Best is coming out in July.
Yes, that's true.
Correct.
So one other quick thing. I know you're trying to wrap up.
No, that's cool.
And I was looking back, I'm pretty sure we've actually been to the Patrick Henry Library before, years ago.
I missed it. I'm now bummed. Okay.
But I can't tell you how much we enjoy working with libraries because I still have my juvenile library card from when I first signed up. It used to be you had to be able to write your name on your card in order to qualify. And so I practiced and practiced and practiced. And Caroline joined the library at a very young age, and the librarians were very helpful to her because both of us quickly outgrew the juvenile section, needed a little direction. But so we have a very fond spot in our heart for libraries and all the work that they do. People don't always realize how important libraries are and librarians are for our readers. And I'm not saying that just because we're talking to a library. It's something that we bear in mind a lot and still frequent our public libraries a lot.
Okay. Well, I was trying to thank you, but I'll say you're welcome and thank you for that as well. Okay. And then finally, I have to put in an ad because this was part of our regular Mystery Book Club calendar. And so next month next month it'll be the third Monday. We'll be doing a Zoom discussion of Antipode and the Sicilian Lions by Mario Giordano, which is just a lovely hoot and much fun. So if you're interested in another mystery discussion, not with an author this time, I'm going to just encourage those of you who are attending to sign up for that. And I hope we'll have a good discussion then as well. And again, thanks so much to all of you and to Caroline and to Charles for coming. And we love your books and we're so glad to be able to be part of what you're doing.
So we've had a wonderful
Deb,
time.
could you please give us the date of your,
And have a great year.
You asked about a date?
yeah,
Somebody
I need
just-
the date of the third Monday meeting and the title.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's going to be March 15th and it'll be at 11:15. I mean, 11:30 rather. And as I said, it's Auntie Poldi and the Sicilian Lions by Mario Giordano. And it takes place in Sicily. He's an Italian author with German roots, and so is his character. So,
Sounds great.
okay, okay. So I'm going to stop my recording and end this session. And I'm